Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today remotely. I'm calling from California, so it's early morning for me. I hope that you're doing well and staying safe. So we're going to talk about UX. For those who know me, this is mostly what I talk about, and the brain and how to advance UX maturity in game studios, because UX is becoming quite trendy, but there's still a lot of misconception about it and what it means and how to implement it in a studio. So for those who don't know me, my name is Celia Hodent. I have a PhD in psychology, and I've been working in the video game industry for the past about 15 years now. I worked at Ubisoft in France. I'm French originally. Then I moved to Ubisoft Montreal. Was working on the Rainbow Six franchise over there mostly. And then I moved to LucasArts, was working on Star Wars games up until LucasArts closed down. And then I moved on to Epic Games. And I became director of UX at Epic. And I worked at the studio level, and I worked very closely with the Fortnite team. And I left Epic in October 2017. Ever since then, I've been doing some independent consulting work. So I'm trying to spread the UX love and make sure that people understand what it is and implement that in a studio. So games, can the teams can make games that are more fun and more efficiently for their players. So the problem is there's still a lot of people that think a bit that way. If you don't get it as like you're stupid, or this is the way it is. And UX is all about shifting from that mindset, or we're just doing whatever we want to do, and so be it. From a mindset when you consider the human factors, you consider that the person who's just discovering your product doesn't know much about it, and you need to understand that so that you can offer the best experience possible. So it's about putting into question the things that you do so that you can offer the best experience rather than staying from our perspective. The maturity model that I'm using for UX is a simplified one. It's called the Kikendo maturity model. It's this one. There's another very interesting model that is from Jacob Nielsen that you can find on the nngroup.com. And you can find that link on my website as well. And you have the link of that at the end. So Jacob Nielsen is really explaining all the different steps to advance UX maturity, and it's very, very long. Takes like years to advance all these steps. I like to use this model because it's more visual and it's easier to talk about it. And so the idea is to try to move towards having a UX culture. But to get there, first of all, we need to go beyond a lot of break down a lot of barriers. And the first one is like unawareness of UX and rejection. Still today, I see people not being aware about UX, or still thinking that UX is just about making the game easier. So because of that, I need to just make sure everybody's on the same page, and I'm gonna try to break down all these things as fast as I can, because I want to make sure that we cover also a little bit more advanced stuff. But that's the problem. Like right now in the game industry, it's very uneven. We're not super far ahead, but there's a lot of discrepancy in between the first steps across the different studios. So here I propose to just go through the 4 big steps in terms for us. Now, what does it mean to try to move the maturity forward in terms of UX? And the first time is to build trust. So if you're a UX practitioner and you've just been hired because people understand that UX is really super trendy, but not sure what does that entail, the first step is to make sure that people understand what you're doing and to build trust with the dev team. The problem is there's still a lot of misconceptions. I still hear this, that UX will distort design intentions, which is not true. Still today, a lot of people are asking me about Dark Souls when I explain, that UX is all about making sure that the player is going to have the best experience possible and remove any frictions that are not by design. I'm like, but what about Dark Souls? So Dark Souls has pretty good UX. First of all, the experience is very defined. The experience of Dark Souls is very focused. It's going to be a very hard experience, and the users are also very well defined. It's pretty niche, and these people are here to suffer. And so Dark Souls is very good at offering the experience that it's supposed to offer. It's also very consistent in terms of its science and feedback. So UX is not about making things super easy and making everything mainstream. This is not what it is about. It's about making sure we all agree about what experience we want to offer to whom, and make sure that this is the experience that we're gonna offer. So, and we in the process, we're gonna remove all the frictions and the frustrations that are not by design, where this is not where we want to put the challenge of the game. Then there's still a lot of people saying, yeah, this is cool, but we don't have enough money or time. We can't do playtest. We can't hire more people. It's just like we would love to, but we can't. So I understand it's still an investment to have a UX mindset across the board, but this is exactly what it is. It is an investment. Today, it would sound really weird to not have some QA testing before shipping a game. So we need to think about all the different UX processes, such as like playtesting, in the same way. It's if like the phrase that I like to say is that don't ask yourself if you can afford to use UX practices. Ask yourself if you can afford not to, because if you wait until too late before you ship the game and there's some problems that could have been identified earlier, well, now it's too late and you've lost a lot of money. And if you want to correct that, it's much more costly than if you did it super early on in the process. And that leads me to another one of my top three misconception is like, oh yeah, UX is something that we can do later in the process, as if it's like a verb, and we come like the UX people come with their magic wand and we UX the shit out of everything. This is not how it works. So I see a lot of times like at the core team, and they're working in a silo, and they're doing stuff like cool stuff together. And I'm like, hey, you have some prototypes that we could test out. Could we just like do that and try to do some play testing? And typically I get some panic people like, no, like you get away from here, like this is not ready yet for testing, it's ugly, it's really not finished. But that's the point, the whole point of testing, it's to test something that is not finished, so that we can iterate on it before we implement it, and also before we art it up. Because if you wait until everything is implemented, and worse, like everything is arted up, well then if there's a problem to fix, it's going to be super costly to tear down everything. And on top of that, you get attached to it. The more advanced a feature is, the more the harder it is to put that into question and to redo it. So UX is not something we do later. It is a mindset that we need to have from day one to make sure that we stay on track. It's all about making sure we stay on track for the experience we want to offer to the users, so the players that we're seeking. So there's also a new one, because now that UX is becoming a thing, like a lot of people are using it, but they use a lot of time as UX/UI. And so now it means just making sure that the interface is going to be good. So for sure, the interface is important. It is part of the experience that users are going to have with your game, but it is a tiny part. Like the experience is everything that your players are going to interact with and perceive. So this is typically the little picture that I showed to remind everybody that UX is a term that was coined by Donald Norman back in the 90s. And it was all about considering the whole experience that people have with a product. And so he thought that there was no term for that. And so that's the reason why I use the term user experience to account for everything. The first time that you hear about the game, how it is marketed, the advertisement around it, how you so for a game, how you download it, where is there there's a launcher, what is the experience in the launcher, then interacting with the game itself, and then afterwards, what do you remember from it, how do you talk about it to your friends, and do you need customer support, or are you going to interact with community managers? All of that is the experience. So I'm more specialized into how players interact with the game itself. And of course, the interface is a big part of the experience, because we see it a lot of time, but it's not just that. It's going to be the music, it's going to be the design, it's going to be the story. All of that is the experience. And so the idea of UX, just to make sure we're all on the same page here, is to ensure that whatever the developers, and when I say developer here, I mean anyone participating into the development of a game, whatever is in your mind and what you're trying to accomplish is what players are going to experience only through the interaction with the what's in the system image. So you're not shipped with the game. And so the idea is to make sure that what you intended is what is effectively experienced by players. So this is what user experience is about. It's a mindset. And to get there, we need to understand that it's not that easy to do that. And the reason why is because we have a lot of biases. So let's play just a little game. So of course, you're not going to be able to yell the answer back at me, but try to think about it. So imagine that little game. You have a bat and a ball, and both of them, they cost $11 total. We know that the bat costs $10 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? So think about it. Just a couple more seconds. I'm going to show you the answer. So think about the answer. All right. So if you found the correct answer, awesome. But many people think when they see that and they try to answer very quickly, they're going to say $1 because we get tricked by the way the question is phrased. But if the ball costs $1 and then the bat costs $10 more than the ball, then the bat costs $11. And so then the total would be $12. So we can do math. It's not a problem. But when we need to make fast decisions, we get tricked all the time by our brain, because the brain is pretty impressive. We do a lot of cool stuff with our brains, but it's also very limited. And the brain that we have is still pretty much the same that we had back in the savannah, where we're trying to survive lions and all that, because at the scale of evolution, we did not evolve in the past thousands of years ago. But our environment is much more complex than when we were still trying to survive in the savannah. And so, the brain that is evolved to survive predators and the jungle is not super good at surviving all the traps that we have in our complex world when we need to have a global economy and all that. So if you're interested into that, I would refer you to Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. So Daniel Kahneman is a psychologist. He's Nobel Prize winner in economics, and he wrote that book about the research that he did with Amos Tversky, all about how the brain reasons. And he says that the brain has two ways or modes of thinking. These are not areas of the brain; it's just like systems and how the brain works. You have the system 1, that's fast, automatic, effortless. That's pretty much the system that we use all day long to get through our day because we're very busy people and we need to get to things very automatically. So any routine task that you do in the morning, you're still waking up, but you're still able to, shower or make coffee and do all that. Or if every morning you have the same you go through the same route because you drop your kids at school or you're going to work pre-COVID. We don't even think about all that, about the navigation. We're just like, we're on autopilot mode. That's system 1. We don't use a lot of attentional resources to make these things work. And the brain is like the echo mode from the brain, and that's really useful because we make countless decisions all day long, and we can't really pay attention to every single one of them. And when we do, we have to use system 2. So system 2 is a system that we use when we need to solve problems, when we need to go to a place that we don't know, when we're out of the routine that we do every day. And so that system is more controlled and it's much more effortful. The brain represents about 2% of the whole body weight, but consumes, I don't remember exactly the percentage, I think it's about 20% of all the energy we're consuming. So it's consuming a lot of energy for its small size. And so we can't use system 2 all the time. And so we rely a lot on system 1 to just like take decisions fast. But the problem is a lot of biases lie in this system. And so, long story short, the brain is very good at making fast decisions and making sense of the world with very little information. That's how we survived our predators back in the jungle. But it's also because of that we're going to make a lot of assumptions and move on with our day. And these assumptions were false. And sometimes it's going to take a long while for us to realize that that was a mistake. And of course, because we have cognitive dissonance, it's really uncomfortable for us to acknowledge that we made a mistake. We're gonna, invent a little story to explain why we did that and was actually not that much of a mistake and blah, blah, blah. So we are very, very biased. This is just a picture showing the extension of our biases in humans. The idea is not for you to read all of them. It's just for you, hopefully, to be overwhelmed by all of these biases so that you can understand why we need so many methodologies and a very defined process so we don't fall for all these biases that we have. And so that when we make a product, we don't fall into our own traps. So this is the reason why we need to understand how the brain works, because the experience of players is happening in their minds. And because the mind is biased and the brain has limitations, we need to understand that to offer the best experience possible to our players. So we need to understand that the gamer's brain is heavily biased, but so is yours. And so as a developer, you're going to fall into traps and you're going to try to make the best decisions for your game. And we know how many decisions we need to make. It's very tedious. And if we don't have a solid process, we just take the risk to fall prey for so many of these biases. Lastly, one of the biases that we have as a developer is we have that curse of knowledge. We know our game too well. It's our baby. And so for us, it's really difficult to anticipate how a new player is going to understand the game and discover it. So we're not the best people to understand these things. And that's the reason why we need tests, play tests, so that we can have players test our game in development so we can see what's going on. So that's the first step, is just to acknowledge that we're biased and that we need these processes. Even if you've been in the game industry, if you've been making games for so many years, it's still good to understand, being able to comprehend why it is so hard and why sometimes we miss the mark, and do that practice of just like shifting. I'm just gonna try to get the sun out of my face, because it's the morning sun here. And so we need to try to do this to shift and to understand why we need these processes. So that's the first time, and understand that it's not here to go against design intentions. The UX mindset is really here to help all the team to accomplish their goals. So then once this is established, that we come here in peace and to work together, we need to show how we can do quick wins, because sometimes it can feel overwhelming. And so this is when so personally, I really always go back to the brain and go back to the main limitations of the brain and work with the teams to try to correct some things really quickly so everybody can understand the value of it. So I know some of you have already seen that, but I know some of you have not. So I'm going to try to go through that very quickly. But this is a representation of what's going on in the brain when we process information from around us, or when we learn. It's always starting with our senses. We have many senses, not just the 5 represented here. So for example, you can sense temperature or your body in space. So we have over 20 senses, and all these senses gather stuff that's going on around us, and then through perception we get that information which we're going to process. And then if it's memorable, or if it's worth learning, what's going on is going to happen. What's going to happen is a change, a physical change, and now memory. So in our brain, whenever we learn something, it means that we memorize it. And memorizing something means that there's going to be a synaptic modification in our brain. So synapses are connections between neurons. And when we learn, we're going to have new synapses, or sometimes synapses are going to be strengthened, or sometimes we lose synapses. So the brain is constantly rearranging itself. We call that brain plasticity. And the brain is not pre-wired in the first place. It's constantly rewiring itself depending on what we do. So depending on the games we play, depending, like on all the talks that you're listening to today, is rewiring your brain. So it's really important to understand that the brain is constantly changing with what you do and what you perceive around you. So between perception and a change in the brain, there's a lot of factors that influence the quality of the process, the quality of learning. You have biological factors. Your DNA has an impact. You have physiological factors. If you just woke up because you're in the West Coast in the US, you're maybe not super awake yet because coffee had not kicked in yet. It's going to be harder for you to follow. Or also if you're in Europe and it's starting to be late and you had a long day, it's also going to be harder for you to follow. Or if you're hungry or whatever, all that is physiological factors that impact, of course, learning and information processing. But here, for games, the impact, the factors that we care about the most are intention, emotion, and motivation. Attention is really important because we know that we learn much better if we pay attention to something. So when you don't pay attention, you're not going to encode that information very well, and therefore you're not likely to remember it well. So attention is really, really important, and both emotion and motivation are here to support attention, because if we care about something or if something is emotional, then we pay attention to it more. So very quickly, I'm going to show you a main limitation of each of these elements. And please keep in mind that this is extremely simplified. The brain doesn't work, we don't have like these independent buckets like that. The brain is extremely complex. So there's a lot of people claiming they know how the brain works, but we know some things. And here I'm going to simplify them. So just keep that in mind. So first of all, one of the main limitations of perception is this. So for example, this is an input, a stimulus. And if you try to figure out what it means, you might not all perceive the same thing here. So some of you might have recognized Street Fighter 2 characters. This was minimalized by artist Ashley Browning. If you immediately perceived this from the stimulus I showed you, well, I mean, good on you, but it means that you have a personal connection with that game. Either you played it and you loved it, or you have a very good game culture, so you know about this game and you recognize the patterns and the colors. If you did not recognize Street Fighter characters, even if you're in the game industry, that it's okay, because it means that maybe you're not as familiar with that game, you're more familiar with other games. Some people sometimes recognize, they perceive Link in the top right character. Other people tell me that they see DNA. Other people tell me they see rugs or Lego blocks. So it all says that perception is subjective. We don't perceive the reality as it is. We all construct a perception of it. And if you're colorblind, and it's the case of about 8% of the male population, you are excluded from this little game right now, and I apologize for that. So it's really important that we don't all perceive the world in the same way. Perception is subjective. And so in your game, you have a lot of stimuli. Playing a video game is just about perceiving a lot of visual and audio and sometimes haptic inputs. And we need to make sure that the players are perceiving them the way we intended. And because perception is subjective, we can't be sure 100% that this is going to happen. So that's the reason why we test. Here's an example of how we did a quick win in Fortnite. When I started in 2013, we tested a bunch of icons that were quite central in the game. So players came over to play a little bit, and then I asked them, what is this? What is that? After playing, and for this icon, so maybe you identify that this was the icon used for traps, the trap category in the main menu, but not all players recognize that as a trap icon. Some people thought it was the ammunition icon because it's pretty close to the ammunition icon. Others thought it was something related to building. And so it was a bit confusing. And Fortnite is not about challenging people into recognizing important icons. So we need to remove that friction that is not by design. So we iterated on it, and we changed the symbol, which later on we arted up, but at the beginning we just test the symbols that we're using. We changed it into a bear trap. There's no bear traps in Fortnite, but it's an archetype that all players then, once we changed it, understood. And this is really important to also remember, it's not because your icon now or your character design or whatever it is you're testing, because again, it's not just about the UI, is recognized within the population that is close to you. So if you're in the US, the US population, or Europe in Europe, you also need to understand that perception changes depending on culture. So archetypes that work well in one culture or in one generation might not work in another cultural generation. So you also need to verify this. So that's a quick win. We can test things like that. Another game that I often like to do is ask my audience to try to remember the sculpture, the Thinker, the Penseur from Auguste Rodin, because it's pretty iconic. So most people have seen it and know how it looks like. But then remembering exactly what is its position, its posture, on which leg or legs exactly is lying which arm or arms of the Thinker, then it's starting to be difficult, and people try to actually do the gesture to remember. So here's the answer, and it's very, very rare that someone tells me, oh yeah, it has both arms on the left leg. Most of the time they say, no, it's the right arm on the left leg, or right on the same side, or whatever. But it's very, very rare that people remember exactly the posture. And it's because memory is fallible. We don't take pictures of things and then we store it somewhere. And when we have to remember it, we bring it back to consciousness. This is not how the brain works. We talked about perception. I was saying that perception is a construct of the brain. Memory is a reconstruction. So we reconstruct things. We don't exactly understand how it works, by the way. We're not going to remember things accurately. And on top of that, we forget a bunch of stuff. So that's the forgetting curve that was made in the 19th century, but it's been replicated in modern times. It's just showing the exponential nature of forgetting. And of course, it's worse if you try to learn something that's not meaningful, that you don't care about. And so it's really important when you teach something to someone, or you make people use an app or a game. They have to discover this world. They have to learn a bunch of stuff about this game. You need to make sure you're going to smooth out that curve, because otherwise, if people, they stop playing, or they play another game that just came out and then come back to your game a week later, it's very likely they're gonna forget stuff, and hopefully not the important stuff for them to have fun with your game. So our memory is fallible, and we need to overcome that by one of the ways we can do that. It's many other ways to do it, but one of the ways we do that, so another quick win, is to reduce the memory load. So for example, instead of asking people to remember what key to press to open something, a searchable object in Fortnite, it's always popping up in the HUD whenever the player is getting close to it. So players don't have to remember that. And that's the power of the HUD. It's here to reduce the memory load, because all the elements that are here on screen are things that players don't have to remember. And so the more you remove from the HUD, the more you're increasing the memory load, and you take the risk that players forget about stuff that is important, and then this is going to create some frustration that we can avoid. So it's really important to try to not remove too much stuff in the HUD. You can remove a HUD if your game is simple enough, but if you have a systemic game, it's a bit complex, you want to have a HUD to help players out. You also need to make sure that it's not too much stuff on the HUD, because then it's overwhelming. So it's finding the right balance is complicated. But here's another example. Players don't need to remember how to what's the name of the thing they want to craft, or what are the ingredients that they need, or the ingredient missing, and how many of that ingredient. They just can pin it in the HUD, and that's a way to also reduce the memory load for that, and so they can just focus on their objective instead of trying to remembering stuff that we don't care. This is not core to the experience of Fortnite to try to remember recipes. That's not what this game is about. Now, you can have games that it's all about remembering stuff, or you can have games that is also about challenging perception, and that's fine. Again, we're here to remove the frictions that are not by design. Okay, so we're gonna play one last game. I'm gonna show you cards. I would like you to choose one card and try to remember it as accurately as you can. It's gonna go pretty fast. So pick a card, try to remember it as accurately as you can. All right, I bet I can guess which card you picked and make it disappear. Let's see if it works online. So hopefully it worked for you. If you're like, oh, what the hell? So if you've been surprised, awesome. It means that my trick worked. And the way it worked is I changed all the cards. So that's a lousy magic trick because I'm not a magician. But this is what magicians do when they make their tricks. They use that technique called misdirection. So they ask you to focus on something, and as you're focusing on something and you think this is about, that trick is about that, they change something else. In psychology, we know that phenomenon very well. It's called change blindness. It means that we sometimes it's really hard for us to see a change from one scene to the next. We're really not good at that because we're not good at paying attention to things. Our attention resources are very scarce, and that makes it really difficult for us to process all the information. And so this is the reason why we need to avoid multitasking situations in the game when this is not the point. Because again, like action games, we challenge a lot of attentional resources, and that's okay. But if it's a moment when you try to teach players something, so like here, try to teach players how to heal, they get hurt for the first time, and so we flash the health HUD on the top left, and then we show a gameplay tip on how to heal, and then it disappears. Well, most players in that playtest, they did not even perceive that there were some things happening in the HUD because they were just focused on killing zombies. So we need to remember that we are not good at multitasking. When we try to multitask, we make mistakes, and that usually doesn't go well. So we want to avoid players to feel overwhelmed when it's not what we want to do. So of course, there are situations where we want them to be challenged in their attentional resources, but not all the time, especially not as they are learning how to play the game. So that's it. Perception is subjective, attentional resources are scarce, and memory is fallible. And depending on your game, you want to make sure that you're not challenging players in a place that you don't want to challenge them. So that's what I mean by removing the frictions that are not by design. So that's the little quick wins just by understanding these limitations of the brain, that we can iterate really faster. And, first it didn't work and then it works. And this is really showing very quickly how we can improve things. And that's usually a good way to introduce the UX practices because it's like showing off why it's so cool. Then the next step was to establish a common language. It's really difficult to talk about something or to solve problems if we don't have the same language in a company or on a team. So that's the reason why I always try to use the same terms and try to explain, how things are named, so that when we see a problem, we can use the same vocabulary so we can understand each other. And so for user experience for games, there's two main big pillars that we care about is usability, the ability of the game to be used. But a game can be easy to use and boring. So we also need to make sure that we understand how the game can be fun. And we care about if it's engaging or not. And so this is the reason why I call the second pillar engageability. So usability and engageability, we have what I try to accomplish in my career is to have some guidelines. It's not necessarily covering everything. It's not exhaustive, but the idea is to establish a common language on the teams so that QA people and designers and artists and programmers and UX folks, they all speak the same language, and they can identify when there's a problem, how it's named, and it's going to make it easier to find out where it's coming from and how to solve it. So usability it's again all about making sure that the brain limitations are taken into account, and they can remove these frictions that are not by design, so people can easily understand how to play the game and what to do. It's also a lot to do with accessibility, making sure that it's not just a subcategory of your users who can play the game, just like the example I gave you with the Street Fighter characters. If you make a puzzle game there that needs to distinguish colors, and it's just like one thing and doesn't have anything to do with the rest of the game, then you're just like excluding players who have a color blindness just for nothing, when it's not really, when colors is not really the core experience of your game. So it's really important, like, to understand that every design decision can potentially exclude some people. So we need to understand how we cannot do that, because not only is it the good thing to do to include everyone, but it's also better business decisions to make sure that you don't have a category like some people in your audience that cannot play your game. So I'm going to go fast because the idea is not to go through all these elements. Engageability is also very important, and it's less understood. Just overall, we understand less why humans do the things they do. So that's the reason why I'm going to spend a little bit more time explaining the vocabulary around engagement. It has a lot to do with motivation, because if you're not motivated to do something, you're not going to do it. So there is no behavior without motivation. Now, you can be motivated to do it because you were forced to do it. Maybe your boss told you, like, you need to watch this presentation, and like, okay. It's still a motivation, but it's extrinsic motivation. You do it to avoid, comments from your boss. So you do it to avoid a punishment. Or maybe you do it because you're interested. So that's intrinsic motivation. So there's a lot of different types of motivation and a lot of theories around motivation. But most of the time, we talk about this dichotomy between extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. And we need to understand both of these to offer the best experience possible to players. So extrinsic motivation, we understand that pretty well in games, just the missions. You have objectives, and once you accomplish your mission, you have a reward. Sometimes it's not super clear for players what sort of goals they have and what they can do with the rewards. So there's a lot of work around making sure they are clear and they are meaningful to players. They understand what they can do with it. But more importantly, it's important to understand intrinsic motivation. And the best theory we have right now is the self-determination theory, that explains that activities that satisfy our needs for competence, autonomy, and relatedness are typically more intrinsically motivating than others. So competence is having a sense of progression. So in games, we need a lot of that. That's why bars that are progression bars is not just motivating because when the bar is filled, you're going to get a reward because you leveled up. It's not just that. It's also a very good feedback on your progression. You're getting better. Or you're seeing that, I don't know, in a battle royale game, you started the game, you were like 55th, and now you did it a second time, 32nd, you get better. So all that is really a good feedback on your competence. It's important that players feel competent in playing the game. Of course, they're going to learn a bunch of stuff. They're going to have setbacks. They're going to die. But as long as they understand why they died and how they can get better, that's really important feeling to have, to be intrinsically motivated to play a game or to do anything in life. Autonomy is about being able to express ourselves. We care about expressing ourselves. We do that through our clothing. We do that through our style, our language. So it's really important for humans. So in a game, you need to offer ways for players to express themselves. So it can be through customization, dance moves in Fortnite. It can also be in how people can solve problems. So a game that is sandbox, like Minecraft or GTA, offers way more autonomy than a game that is scripted, because players can have a lot of different ways to solve a problem or to accomplish a goal. So that's offering more autonomy, and as long as players can feel competent, because if you have autonomy and you don't know what to do and you're lost, then you don't feel competent. So we have to think about these elements and how they interact with one another. And last but not least, relatedness. We're a very social species. We really care about connecting with one another. So it goes a lot through cooperation. And believe it or not, cooperation is actually stronger than competition. So it's, and like you can see that in sports and esports. Most sports games are team based. We cooperate within the team and we compete against another team. So making sure that we can satisfy players' needs in competence, autonomy, and relatedness, and making sure that it is meaningful in your game and how we can meaningfully express that and how they interact with one another is really key for engagement. So we need to, again, we need to know these words so that we can see if there's a weakness in our game. We can say, well, yeah, that here because players don't feel autonomous, they feel controlled, or here they cannot really feel competent because they don't have the correct feedback on screen. So that's really helping us figure out what's going on. And we need to keep in mind to always show value to players and explain, why they care about things. Okay, so we care also about emotion in game design. So it's called game feel. I'm not going to explain that because we don't have the time, but know that this is also very important to establish, to have a common vocabulary, because it's very important because we interact with the system and it needs to be pleasurable. Offering novelties to players is really important. That's why we always have to have patches and ship, new seasons and new maps and new everything, because otherwise, players, they're getting bored. So it's really important to always keep things fresh and offer surprises to players. And game flow is really also important because we need to manage the difficulty curve. So a game should not be too easy or too hard. We also need to manage the rhythm of stress or pressure in a game, otherwise it can feel overwhelming. And last but not least, onboarding is really important. We need to make sure that players can understand how to be competent in the game, because otherwise they're not going to have fun. So the flow zone is making sure the game is not too easy, not too hard. So it's really important to not make the game too easy and to manage stress. So we can have stressful situations, but for example, as the first time that players play Fortnite in the Save the World, we had that little low wall so that enemies were spawning, and immediately you have some stress. Immediately you start playing the game and shoot enemies, but they're behind the wall, so it's not an immediate threat, and so it's a manageable stress. So it's all things like that, and also how we can make sure we teach the game to players in a meaningful way. And in contextual way, in a way they can learn by doing. So I'm just going to show you quickly how we iterated on how to teach building to players. So again, this is the Save the World mode. So it's important to place players in a situation when this is about a system or mechanics that's really key to your game, instead of having like screens and explaining how it works. This is not really engaging, and that's learning then doing, and people are not really paying attention to that because they don't care. So if it's really important for players to learn this, and you think that it's going to be complicated because it's a system that is not very familiar to players, we need to pay attention to how to teach that. So for example, in Fortnite, I cut this down off so I can talk about it. The idea was to try to think about why would they need to care building? Because maybe they need to protect a thing. So then we tell them, oh, we need to protect that tractor. Okay, so the players find the tractor. They, of course, first try to destroy it. But then they understand, okay, if I need to protect it, it's in a barn, I just need to close the barn. They have 2 minutes to do that because you can see there's a countdown. And so the first time they try to build, they try to do that, but it's not super clear because they actually need to destroy the little panels on the side to fit these two walls. And so a lot of players were actually building around it. And so this is what that player is trying to do now, and places one wooden wall and then tries to place another one, but no more resources. And the enemies are spawning and coming in 20 seconds. So this is an example where we tested a lot of these situations very early on, even though we didn't have the story. We didn't know exactly how the systems would look like in the end, but it's important to very early on test the situations of how we're going to teach players. And here, there was a lot of problems. It's in context. Players can really do it as they learn it, but it's not really meaningful because it's misleading. It's counterintuitive, and because they're in a stressful situation, even like understanding that they need to destroy the 2 panels to be able to fit two new walls. It's still like too much. It's a bit overwhelming because it's at the beginning of the game. And so players are set for failure. And so we iterated on that, and the level designer had a great idea, is that, instead of thinking of a weird situation that we fabricate, how about we spawn the players in a pit at the beginning of the game? They're being in a pit, in a hole, and they need to build their way out of it.
Way to build. You got out of that pit.
So by having, this vocabulary, understanding what is going to be meaningful for players, it's helping us to iterate faster and try to find situations, which it's actually even easier in terms of implementation to do the second version. And it's much more efficient, and players don't feel that they're being taught. They don't feel that they're in a tutorial. They just feel that they're playing the game. And so by understanding and having that common vocabulary, we can do these things, and we can make sure to offer a better experience for players so that they can have fun and be engaged. Another thing about the vocabulary is talking about the UX rules. It's a little bit all over the place, but we have UX designers. So these people are typically working on the information architecture, interaction design, or visual design. They're the ones making things functional for players based on what the game and system designers worked for the game. So I'm asked very often, what's the difference between a UX designer and a game designer? The game designer is establishing the why, what are the rules in the game? Why would player cares about a system, and etc. A UX designer, they care about the how. How are we going to convey that to players so they can understand how it works? UX researchers are here to evaluate and test using the scientific method. So they're the ones verifying if the experience intended is the one felt and perceived by players, and if not, how we can fix it. Of course, with the help of UX designers and game designers, everyone on the team, really, if we have a good common vocabulary. Then you have data analysts. They do the same thing as UX researchers, but they don't use the same sort of data. So it's more on a large scale using telemetry data. And finally, you have UX strategists. So that's one of the things that I do, is make sure that to manage, coordinate, advocate for UX, I'll make sure we hire the right people and we have the right process. So we also need to make sure we understand what we mean with the roles around UX. All right, I'm running a bit late, but I'm going to try to wrap it up quickly. We need to have also a good process to make it work, because making games is really hard, and we're always on fire, and it's complicated. And when we are in an urgent situation, this is when we do things too fast, and if we don't have a solid process, then everything goes to hell. So this is the reason why we need to establish, first of all, how we're going to test. If you have a way to have a playtesting lab at your studio, that's great. Otherwise, identify a partner outside to do playtest, and think about all the different tests you can do at different stages. So there's always something that you can test. It's never too early to test, but you cannot test everything at every stages, but there's always something to test. So make sure that you have the help of a UX researcher that can help you with all the different research that you can do at the different stages of the game, so you're not just waiting too late and waiting just once it's in beta to test anything. Also, make sure that you have a pipeline. If you do test, that's great, but make sure that you test in a specific mindset. So you need to start with your hypothesis. What are you testing at that moment? What are the questions that you're trying to answer as a team? Because if you're not thinking about this as we all together trying to find solutions to our problem and to answer our questions, then it's not going to be as efficient. If you're just like, hey, we should test, can you just test the UX of the game? That's not going to be as efficient. You need to think about what is it where you are in the game, what you're trying to accomplish, what are the systems that you implement and they're trying to do, so that you can really test with that in mind. And when you find a weakness, you need to find out why it's happening and not just react and just be driven by the data, but try to understand what the data is telling you. Because as I told you before, perception is subjective. And for one reality, we have many different perceptions of it. And so if you just look at the data, you might be misled and take the wrong decisions to fix it. So an example that I often take is in Fortnite. There were a lot of players that were frustrated because they thought it was too grindy. And so it could be because the system design was not good enough, or there were like problems in the math. But turns out it was more because people did not understand the weak points. The weak point is here. If you aim at the weak point, you're going to destroy things faster. But players were not using it, and the whole system design was based off the assumption that players are going to use the weak points, and they were not using it. So even after we iterated on it, and we made it bigger and blue and all that, it's still not working well. And in the end, we did not solve this in the UI. The game designer solved it by removing this from the beginning and then adding it in the skill tree. And so that players are discovering it much better. So again, we need to have an understanding of what the data is telling us. I'm going to give you one more example, and then I'm going to wrap it up. This is on Paragon. There was we did a lot of tests, and we saw a lot of people not understanding the tower aggro rules, and they were dying to towers, and they were tower diving in this MOBA. And the video should be playing. Okay, so we were seeing a lot of players tower diving. And so if we understand all the stuff that we talked about earlier, we understand that if players, they don't understand how the tower aggro rules, they're not going to feel competent in playing the game. So for us, it's a big red flag. And we identify that month before launch just through playtesting. And after the game was launched, that was verified through telemetry data. And we found out that data analysts found out that the top one reason for people to churn from Paragon were people dying to towers. And so this is something we identify very early on. And if you have a good process, you can see these problems very early instead of waiting too late. So this is all about having a design thinking process. And a lot of people asking me, when can we add UX in the process? Well, UX is the process. So UX is the concern of everyone. It is a mindset. And this is what we need to understand. So build trust, establish quick wins, establish a common language, and a very defined process so that you can advance UX. And most in the game industry, the people that are the most advanced are just starting to get at stage 4. So we're just starting to have processes that are more centralized, but I don't know yet any game studio that really has a UX culture. That's going to take more years for us, I think. And it's also going to mean that we need to think about ethics and what are the ethical lines that we don't want to cross, especially around the attention economy that's having a lot of press. So it starts also by defining your studio values if we want to reach that UX culture. All right, so I went a bit over. I'm sorry. I didn't have a lot of time to prepare this presentation, so I was trying to find the right balance. It's always a struggle, especially when we could not test it beforehand. So I hope that we did not go too fast, but I'm happy to answer your questions. And if you don't have the time to ask your question here, poke me on Twitter or on LinkedIn. This is the place that you can find me, or check my resources on my website. Thanks for your attention.